The situation begins with something that seems, at first glance, unrelated to medicine. A letter, a deadline, a septic system buried beneath rock. But if you look closely, the issue is no longer just structural. It is clinical, because when a 73-year-old woman is placed under sustained pressure, financial, emotional, environmental, the body does not separate those stresses into categories. It absorbs them all the same way. And that is where concern begins. Not at the moment the letter arrives, but in what follows after. The sleepless nights, the reduced appetite, the constant anticipation of loss. These are not just reactions. They are measurable risks. Betty Whittaker has spent decades living within a predictable rhythm. The same walls, the same porch, the same routine. That stability, however modest, functioned as a form of protection. Not from hardship, but from collapse. Now that structure is being disrupted. And disruption, in someone her age, is not neutral. It is cumulative. When Brian arrived and found her holding the letter, what he was seeing was not just fear. It was the beginning of physiological strain. Her hands were trembling. That matters, because tremors in that context are not only emotional. They can signal elevated stress hormones, fatigue, or underlying neurological sensitivity that becomes more visible under pressure. Her voice, steady but strained, carried another indicator. Chronic stress does not always produce panic. In older adults, it often produces something quieter. A flattening of tone, a narrowing of emotional range, a kind of controlled exhaustion. I ain't got nowhere to go. That sentence is not just situational. It reflects cognitive load, the brain trying to process a problem that has no immediate solution. And when the brain cannot resolve a threat, it does something else. It loops. That loop is what keeps her awake at night. Sleep disruption is one of the earliest and most dangerous signs in cases like this. Not because of discomfort, but because sleep is where the body repairs itself. Without it, everything weakens. Immune response declines. Cognitive clarity fades. Emotional regulation erodes. So when Betty says she hasn't slept properly since the letter arrived, that is not a side detail. That is a primary concern. Now consider nutrition. She mentions eating less, cooking less. Again, this is not just mood. It is a pattern. Stress suppresses appetite. In older adults, that suppression can lead quickly to weight loss, which then leads to reduced strength, increased fall risk, and slower recovery from even minor illness. The chain reaction is quiet, but it is precise. Less food, less energy, less movement, more vulnerability, and all of it begins with something that, on paper, looks like a housing issue. This is where most observers misunderstand the situation. They ask, can the septic system be fixed? But a more accurate question is this. What is the cost of waiting 30 days under this level of stress? Because the body does not wait. It adapts or it deteriorates. And in Betty's case, the signs suggest strain, not adaptation. There is another layer here that requires attention. Control. For decades, Betty has operated within a system she understands, even if that system is limited. She knows the house. She knows the land. She knows the rhythm of her environment. That familiarity reduces cognitive burden. Now, with the introduction of deadlines, inspectors, legal language, and uncertain outcomes, that burden increases dramatically. Cognitive overload in older adults can present subtly. Confusion, fatigue, withdrawal. When the state worker returns and speaks in procedural terms, the gap between language and understanding becomes visible. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. That sentence offers no clarity. And without clarity, the brain cannot form a plan. Without a plan, stress intensifies. This is not about intelligence or capability. It is about mismatch. Institutional language versus lived reality. And in that mismatch, the person under pressure is always at a disadvantage. Now look at Larry. He speaks less, observes more, repeats a single phrase. Ain't right, ain't right at all. That repetition is also a signal. It suggests limited engagement with the complexity of the situation, possibly due to cognitive strain, emotional overwhelm, or pre-existing conditions that are being amplified. In households like this, where one person carries most of the decision-making weight, the burden becomes uneven. Betty is not only managing her own stress, she is managing the environment for both of them. That compounds the effect. So when she steps outside at night, cigarette in hand, asking if anyone ever gets tired of being strong, the question is not rhetorical. It is diagnostic. It points to fatigue beyond the physical. Decision fatigue, emotional fatigue, existential fatigue, and all three increase risk. There's also the issue of time perception. Feels like they're going faster now that I'm watching. That statement reflects a shift. When individuals are placed under deadline pressure, especially in uncertain conditions, time can begin to feel compressed. This creates urgency without direction. And urgency without direction leads to panic or paralysis. Neither outcome is safe. Now consider the estimate. $7,850. For someone with limited financial resources, that number does not function as a goal. It functions as a barrier. And when a barrier appears insurmountable, the brain often stops attempting to solve the problem altogether. This is not laziness. It is protective shutdown. Why expend energy on something that appears impossible? But that shutdown comes with consequences. Inaction within a fixed deadline leads directly to forced outcomes. And forced outcomes, particularly relocation, introduce new medical risks. Loss of environment, loss of routine, loss of control. Each of those is independently significant. Together, they are destabilizing. Now at uncertainty about where she would go. The state worker cannot provide a clear answer. That uncertainty creates anticipatory stress. And anticipatory stress is often more damaging than immediate crisis because it has no end point. The body remains in a prolonged state of alert. Heart rate elevated. Cortisol levels sustained. Recovery mechanism suppressed. Over time, that state becomes unsustainable. This is why the situation must be reframed. It is not a housing problem with a medical side effect. It is a medical risk triggered by a housing problem. And that distinction matters because it changes what support is required. Fixing the septic system addresses the surface. But addressing Betty's condition requires something else. Stability, predictability, clear communication, and immediate intervention in areas that are already showing signs of decline. Sleep, nutrition, emotional support, medical evaluation. Because if those are not addressed, even a resolved housing issue will not restore her baseline. The damage will have already begun. Now, there's a tendency to look at resilience in stories like this, to point out that she has survived worse, that she has endured decades of hardship. And that is true. But resilience is not infinite. It is cumulative. And each new stressor does not start from zero. It builds on what came before. So the question is not whether she can endure this. The question is how much this endurance will cost her, and whether that cost is being recognized early enough to prevent irreversible decline. When Brian stands in the doorway and says, "This ain't right," he is responding to something instinctive, not just the unfairness of the situation, but the visible strain, the slowed movements, the quiet house, the sense that something is beginning to give. That instinct should not be dismissed. It should be examined. Because in many cases, early warning signs are not found in data. They are found in observation. And right now, the observations are consistent. Fatigue, sleep disruption, reduced intake, emotional strain, cognitive pressure. Individually, each can be managed. Together, they form a pattern, and that pattern points to risk. The kind of risk that does not announce itself dramatically, but develops quietly over days and weeks until intervention becomes urgent. So the focus cannot remain only on the deadline. It has to expand to include what that deadline is doing to her. Because by the time the 30 days are over, the outcome will not only be about where she lives, it will be about what condition she is in when she gets there. And that is the part that cannot be rebuilt once it is lost. The pressure does not stay contained inside a single moment. It spreads, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, through routine, through habit, through the small decisions that begin to change without being noticed. That is where the second layer of concern begins. Not with the letter itself, but with what it interrupts. Because for someone like Betty, routine is not preference. It is structure. Morning coffee at the same time. Movement through the same rooms. Familiar objects in familiar places. These are not just habits. They are anchors. And when those anchors are disrupted, the body does not simply adjust. It recalibrates under stress. You can already see that recalibration happening. She stops cooking full meals. That detail matters more than it seems. Cooking requires planning, energy, sequencing, and motivation. When those begin to decline, it often signals that the brain is prioritizing survival over maintenance. The body begins to conserve. Less effort, less movement, less engagement. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal. From the inside, it is adaptation. But adaptation, in this case, comes at a cost. Because every reduction in activity leads to further decline. Muscle strength decreases. Balance becomes less stable. Endurance shortens. And in older adults, that process does not reverse easily. Now consider the cigarettes. She is smoking more frequently. Again, this is not just behavior. It is coping. Nicotine provides short-term relief from stress by altering neurotransmitter activity. It creates a brief sense of calm, a moment of control. But it also introduces another layer of risk. Elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, reduced oxygen efficiency. Under normal conditions, the body compensates. Under stress, that compensation becomes harder. So the very tool she is using to manage anxiety is also placing additional strain on the same systems already under pressure. This is how laid risk develops. Not from one factor, but from multiple small adjustments that begin to interact. Now look at her interaction with the calendar. Crossing off days. That action is symbolic, but it also reveals something deeper. She is tracking time not as progression, but as loss. Each day is not a step forward. It is a step closer to displacement. That shift in perception changes how the brain processes time. Instead of planning, it anticipates. Instead of organizing, it reacts. And that constant anticipation keeps the stress response active. There is no recovery period, no reset, just a continuous forward motion toward an outcome she cannot control. That is where the psychological strain becomes physiological, because the body cannot remain in that state indefinitely. Eventually, something gives. Sometimes it is energy. Sometimes it is clarity. Sometimes it is physical stability. Now consider the phone calls. She tries to reach the county. No answer. A machine. That interaction, repeated over days, introduces another factor. Helplessness. Not the abstract kind, the learned kind. When effort does not produce response, the brain begins to reduce effort. Why call again if no one answers? Why try again if nothing changes? This is not surrender. It is efficiency. But in this context, it reduces the likelihood of intervention. And that increases risk. Because systems that rely on persistence tend to fail those who are already under strain. Now shift to the inspector's return. He offers a conditional extension. If you can show proof of an attempt. On paper, that sounds reasonable. In practice, it introduces a paradox. To gain time, she must demonstrate progress. To demonstrate progress, she must have resources. But the absence of resources is the core problem. So the condition becomes unattainable. And unattainable conditions increase stress more than direct refusal. Because they create the illusion of possibility without the means to achieve it. That illusion keeps the brain engaged in a problem it cannot solve. And that engagement is exhausting. Now consider Brian's role. He is present. He listens. He attempts to find solutions. That matters, because social support is one of the strongest protective factors in situations like this. But even support has limits. He cannot change the deadline. He cannot produce immediate funds. He cannot resolve legal ambiguity. So his presence, while stabilizing emotionally, does not eliminate the underlying stressor. And that creates a tension, relief in the moment, pressure in the system, both existing at the same time. Now look at Betty's statement again. Strength don't pay no bills. That is not frustration. It is recognition. She understands the gap between effort and outcome. And when that gap becomes too wide, motivation begins to decline. Not because she is giving up, but because the system is not responding to effort in a meaningful way. That is where medical concern shifts from acute stress to chronic strain. Because chronic strain is what leads to decline, not in a single event, but over time. Now consider sleep again. Not just the absence of it, but the quality. Even when she rests, the presence of unresolved stress reduces deep sleep cycles. The body may lie still, but it does not recover. And without recovery, the next day begins at a deficit. That deficit accumulates, day after day, until the baseline shifts. Fatigue becomes normal. Clarity becomes inconsistent. Reaction time slows. And in that state, risk increases. A misstep, a moment of dizziness, a delayed response. These are small events. But in older adults, small events can have large consequences. Now consider nutrition again. Reduced meals mean reduced intake of essential nutrients. Protein for muscle maintenance. Vitamins for immune function. Hydration for cognitive clarity. Without those, the body becomes more fragile. Not immediately, but progressively. And that fragility is often invisible until it reaches a threshold. Now combine all of these factors. Sleep disruption, reduced nutrition, increased smoking, emotional strain, cognitive overload, unresolved uncertainty. Each one is manageable alone. Together, they create a system under pressure, and systems under pressure tend to fail at their weakest point. The challenge is identifying that point before failure occurs. In Betty's case, it is not yet clear where that point is, but the indicators suggest it is approaching. Now consider the broader context. The internet response. Support, outrage, suggestions. That activity creates noise, and noise can be overwhelming, especially for someone already under cognitive strain. Too many options, too many voices, too many conflicting suggestions. That does not simplify the problem. It complicates it, and complexity increases cognitive load. So even well-intentioned support can become another layer of pressure if it is not structured. This is why clarity becomes critical. Not more information, better information, actionable steps, defined roles, clear timelines. Without that, the situation remains reactive, and reactive systems are less stable. Now return to the central question. What are doctors concerned about? Not the septic system itself, but the cascade it has triggered, because the body does not respond to causes. It responds to conditions. And right now, the conditions are unstable. That instability is measurable in behavior, in speech, in routine, in physical signs. And those measurements point to risk, not immediate crisis, but progressive decline, the kind that can be prevented, but only if recognized early and addressed directly. Because if the focus remains only on the external problem, the internal effects will continue unchecked. And by the time the external problem is resolved, the internal damage may already be established. That is the critical window, the period where intervention can still restore balance. But only if the situation is understood for what it is. Not just a housing issue, but a health event in slow motion. And slow motion does not mean less serious. It means less visible, which makes it easier to overlook, until it is no longer possible to ignore. There's a point in situations like this where the concern shifts again, not from stress to strain, but from strain to consequence. And that shift does not happen all at once. It happens quietly, often without a clear moment you can point to and say, this is where things changed. It begins with small inconsistencies, a delay in response, a forgotten step, a hesitation where there used to be certainty. And in someone under sustained pressure, those inconsistencies are not random. They are signals. Now consider Betty's environment again. The house itself, worn, familiar, imperfect, but known. Every object has a place. Every movement has a pattern. That familiarity reduces the need for active decision-making. The brain does not have to process each step. It recognizes, it predicts, it moves efficiently. That efficiency is protective. But once the possibility of losing that environment becomes real, the brain begins to detach from it. Not emotionally at first. Functionally. Why organize a space you may leave? Why maintain a system that may disappear? This is where behavior begins to change. Less cleaning, less cooking, less structure, not because she no longer cares, but because the future of that space is uncertain. And uncertainty reduces investment. That reduction, again, feeds back into physical decline. Because the environment becomes less supportive. Clutter increases fall risk. Irregular meals reduce energy. Disorganization increases cognitive load. The house, which once stabilized her, begins to mirror the instability she is experiencing. Now consider memory. Under stress, the brain prioritizes immediate threats, deadlines, conversations, unresolved problems. Other information becomes secondary. Appointments may be forgotten. Instructions may be misremembered. Details may blur. This is not long-term cognitive decline. It is acute overload. But acute overload, if sustained, can resemble early cognitive impairment. And that resemblance is dangerous, because it can lead to misinterpretation. Someone may look at her and think she is declining, when in reality, she is overwhelmed. The distinction matters, because the response should be different. Support, not assumption. Now look at her interaction with the inspector again. She asks a direct question. What happens if we can't fix it? The answer is indirect. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. That exchange creates a gap between question and answer, and the brain does not leave gaps empty. It fills them, often with worst-case scenarios. Eviction, separation, loss. That filling process is automatic, and it increases anxiety, because the imagined outcome is often more severe than the actual one. But without clear information, imagination becomes the only available tool. Now consider mobility. She is moving less, sitting more, spending longer periods on the porch. That shift is subtle, but important. Reduced movement leads to reduced circulation. Reduced circulation leads to stiffness, fatigue, and decreased balance. And in older adults, even short periods of reduced mobility can have measurable effects. Muscle tone declines quickly. Joint flexibility decreases. Reaction time slows. This is why prolonged stress is not just psychological. It changes behavior, and behavior changes physiology. Now consider the nights. She sits outside, smokes, looks at the hills. That scene is quiet, but it carries weight. Because nighttime is when unresolved stress becomes most visible. During the day, there are tasks, conversations, distractions. At night, there's only thought. And thought, under pressure, tends to loop. What will happen? Where will I go? How will I fix this? Those loops prevent rest. And without rest, the next day begins with less capacity. Now add another layer. Social isolation. Even though Brian visits, even though there is some contact, the overall environment is still limited. There are no multiple points of support. No rotating system of care. No structured check-ins. That means any decline, even small, may go unnoticed until it becomes significant. And in situations like this, early detection is critical. Because once decline reaches a certain threshold, recovery becomes more difficult. Now consider the financial aspect again. The estimate, $7,850. That number does not just represent cost. It represents impossibility. And when the brain categorizes something as impossible, it shifts strategy. From problem-solving to endurance. From action to waiting. That shift reduces initiative. Not because she lacks it, but because the outcome appears unattainable. And when initiative declines, external support becomes even more important. Because the system cannot sustain itself internally. Now look at Brian's observation. This ain't about septic tanks. It's about time. That statement is more accurate than it appears. Because time, under pressure, behaves differently. It compresses. It accelerates. And it reduces the window for effective intervention. Every day that passes without resolution increases cumulative stress. And cumulative stress increases risk. Now consider the possibility of relocation. Not the logistics. The impact. Moving at 73 is not the same as moving at 30. It is not just a change of address. It is a complete reset of environment, routine, and support. New layout, new sounds, new expectations. The brain must remap everything. And that process requires energy. Energy that is already being depleted. So even if relocation solves the external problem, it introduces a new internal challenge. Adaptation. And adaptation under stress is more difficult. This is why timing matters. If relocation occurs after prolonged strain, the ability to adapt is reduced. If it occurs with support and preparation, the outcome is different. Now consider the phrase she uses again. I don't even know what I'm fighting anymore. That statement reflects a shift from clear purpose to ambiguity. And ambiguity reduces motivation because the goal is no longer defined. Is she fighting to stay, to fix, to delay? Without clarity, effort becomes scattered, and scattered effort is less effective. Now consider Larry again. His presence is quiet, but his role is significant. He is part of the system she is trying to maintain, and his limited engagement means the burden remains primarily on her. That imbalance increases strain, because she is not only managing herself, she is managing the environment for both of them. Now combine everything. Environmental uncertainty, cognitive overload, physical reduction, emotional strain, limited support, financial impossibility. This is not a single problem. It is a system under pressure, and systems under pressure require intervention at multiple points, not just one. Now return to the central concern. Doctors are not only looking at symptoms, they are looking at trajectory. Where is this going? If nothing changes, what happens next? And the answer is not immediate collapse. It is gradual decline. Less sleep, less food, less movement, less clarity, until one day, something small becomes something serious. A fall, an illness, a moment of confusion. And that moment becomes the point where intervention is no longer optional. It is urgent. The goal is to prevent reaching that point, which means acting before the decline becomes visible to everyone. Because by the time it is obvious, it has already progressed. This is why the situation must be understood not as a future risk, but as a present condition, already developing, already measurable, already affecting behavior and physiology. And that is where the focus must remain, not only on what will happen in 30 days, but on what is happening right now. Because right now is where the outcome is being shaped, quietly, gradually, but decisively. At this stage, the concern is no longer theoretical. It becomes practical. What can actually stabilize this situation before the decline accelerates? Because by now, the pattern is clear. The issue is not just the septic system. It is not just the deadline. It is the accumulation of pressure without relief. And pressure without interruption leads to breakdown. So the response has to be structured. Not emotional. Not reactive. Structured. The first point is immediate stabilization. Sleep has to be addressed first. Not eventually. Not when the situation resolves. Now. Because without sleep, nothing else holds. Even small interventions matter. a consistent sleep schedule, reduced stimulation at night, someone checking in before bed. These are not complex solutions, but they interrupt the cycle. The second point is nutrition. She cannot continue eating less without consequence. Even simple, repeatable meals matter more than variety right now. Consistency over complexity. Regular intake over occasional effort. Because energy is not optional in a situation like this. It is the base requirement. The third point is cognitive load. Right now, she is carrying too many unknowns. That has to be reduced. Clear answers, even if they are not ideal. What happens if the deadline passes? Where would she go? Who is responsible for what? Uncertainty is more damaging than bad news. Because the brain can adapt to a known outcome. It cannot stabilize around an unknown one. The fourth point is shared responsibility. She cannot remain the only decision-maker in this situation. Even if she has carried that role for years, this is the moment where that model stops working. Someone else needs to handle communication with officials. Someone else needs to track timelines. Someone else needs to translate information into clear steps. Not to take control away from her, but to reduce the burden she is currently carrying alone. The fifth point is medical awareness. Not necessarily intervention yet, but observation. Changes in sleep, appetite, movement, and clarity need to be tracked. Because those changes will determine whether the situation is stabilizing or declining. And if decline is detected early, the response can adjust. If it is detected late, options become limited. Now consider the timeline again. 30 days. At first, it felt like a countdown to a decision. Now it should be understood as a window for intervention. Not to fix everything, but to prevent deterioration. Because even if the housing issue is not resolved within that time, her condition can still be stabilized. And that changes the outcome. Because the worst-case scenario is not relocation. It is relocation combined with decline. That combination is what creates long-term damage. So the focus shifts from solving the entire problem to controlling the factors that are already causing harm. Sleep, nutrition, clarity, support. These are the variables that can still be influenced. And influencing them now determines what condition she will be in when the situation resolves. Because one outcome is manageable, the other is not. And the difference between them is not time. It is intervention. At the center of all this, there's a question that has nothing to do with septic systems, deadlines, or even relocation. It is a question about thresholds. How much strain can a person carry before the system begins to fail? Because Betty has not reached collapse, but she is no longer at baseline. And that distinction matters. She is in transition, not from one home to another, but from stability to vulnerability. And once that transition begins, the direction it takes depends on what happens next. This is where supporters often misunderstand their role. They focus on the outcome. Fix the house. Raise the money. Solve the problem. But the more immediate need is not resolution. It is protection. Protection of her current condition. Because if her condition declines while the problem is being solved, the solution arrives too late to restore what was lost. So the question becomes more precise. What actually protects her right now? Not attention, not speculation, not urgency without structure. What protects her is consistency. The same few people showing up regularly. The same information being communicated clearly. The same basic needs being met without interruption. That kind of consistency creates something the situation currently lacks. Predictability. And predictability allows the body to stabilize, even under pressure. Now consider the idea of help. There is a difference between visible help and effective help. Visible help is loud. It gathers attention. It spreads quickly. It creates momentum. But it is often inconsistent. Effective help is quiet. It repeats. It holds. It remains. And in cases like this, quiet systems outperform loud ones. Because the body responds to what is repeated, not what is dramatic. Now return to Betty's own words. I've been fighting my whole life. That statement carries weight. Because it tells you something important. She knows how to endure. But endurance is not the same as recovery. And at this stage, recovery is what matters. Not pushing further, not holding on longer, but stabilizing enough to prevent further loss. That is the shift, from survival to preservation. And that shift requires a different kind of response. Less pressure, more structure, less uncertainty, more clarity. Because the outcome of this situation will not be determined only by whether she stays or leaves. It will be determined by the condition she is in when that decision becomes real. If she remains stable, there are options. If she declines, those options narrow. And once they narrow enough, the system begins making decisions for her. That is the point that must be avoided. So the focus stays here, not on what might happen in the future, but on what is already happening now. Because the signs are present, subtle, but consistent, and they point in one direction. Unless something interrupts the pattern continues. And continuation, in this case, does not lead to resolution. It leads to deterioration. So the role of anyone watching this is not to react louder. It is to think more precisely. What reduces strain? What increases stability? What can be repeated every day? Not just once. Because those answers, not the dramatic ones, are the ones that change outcomes. And in a situation like this, the outcome is not a story. It is a condition, one that is still, for now, within reach of being protected. But only if the focus shifts in time. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.